I've got another small 7x10" transparent watercolor to share with you today. It's been a while since I painted something other than birds, so I ended up working on an interesting insect that mimics wasps. This is a brown mantidfly, which honestly looks a bit like a mashup of a praying mantis and a European paper wasp. My daughter discovered this one in our front garden. It's an unusual insect that we don't see very often, so we rushed to get our cameras before it flew off. I did the painting on a block of Arches 140-pound hot-press paper. I started by masking off the foreground leaves and the mantidfly. I painted the background in two main sections. I pre-wet the top half of the page for a wet-on-wet wash. I pre-mixed several different greens. I had a super dark made with phthalo green and cadmium red medium, a slightly lighter desaturated green with those same colors but with some added chrome orange, and another one with some added yellow ochre. I also had a light option with sap green and lemon yellow. Using a 1-inch flat brush with the page inverted, I covered what will be the top half of the page, switching from the darker options close to the middle and getting lighter as I worked to the edge. I switched to a number 4 round brush to start dropping in the additional pigment as it was mixing on the page. The smaller brush would allow me to refine the leaf edge more accurately. If I add wet pigments into a page that's drying, it causes intentional backruns, which can sort of look like abstract blurry leaves. That's the look I was going for here. I brought in some additional super darks to the middle edge. I want the wings to have lighter areas around them because they're half clear and half dark, so I charged in some of my lightest greens in that area. To better control exactly where the paint was being placed, I switched to a number 2 round brush. I was pretty happy with the overall tones for this section of the painting, so I hit it with the hairdryer to lock it in. Next was to paint in the foreground leaf that the mantidfly was sitting on. I did this wash on dry paper, using my 1-inch flat brush and the desaturated green made with phthalo green, a little cadmium red, and yellow ochre. I started at the painted top edge and allowed gravity to help pull the wash down the page. Once the base color was in, I hit that with the hairdryer. I then glazed in a different section of the leaf at the bottom and started rendering in some of the leaves' veins using a number 4 round brush. Afterwards, I added in some of the shadow beneath the mantidfly. Switching to a number 2 round brush, I rendered a few holes in the leaf. These should add some more visual interest. I like showing leaves a bit beaten up because they have more personality, color, and surface details. I started glazing in some texture to the leaf. I just finished 19 paintings on cold press paper, and this was my first after switching back to some hot pressed. Each paper type has its advantages. The cold press takes a wash much easier and more predictably, neatly soaking into the page. On hot press, you have to work a lot harder for even results. Edges of the washes and glazes are more visible. For making a soft shadow under the mantidfly, it took many light overlapping glazes to keep things looking smooth. After a little more detail was added to the bottom edge of the main leaf, I removed the frisket covering the foreground leaves. A wash of base color was applied to those, and I started glazing in more shading to all of the leaves. My photo reference was all dark and blurry in the background, having only the one main leaf with no others in the background. I thought it would be more interesting compositionally to have some more elements in the frame. Since the mantidfly had a lot of triangular elements on it, for example its folded legs, its head, and wings, as did the ragged edge of the main leaf, I kept the background leaves more or less triangular so the page got further divided up into triangles. Knowing my mantidfly would be dominated by warm tones, I started washing in some yellows to the main leaf. By making many passes or washes of color, it'll eventually start building up texture. Some sections of the background leaves got rendered with the super dark tones of the opening wash to help them recede into the page. You can see from the palette on the right that I was mostly using my same base greens in the well plate for glazing in the leaves. Occasionally I'll bring in some orange or blues to mix it up a little. Since there was a lot of fine detail on the legs, I needed to get the main leaf almost finished before removing the frisket. In the areas around the holes in the leaves, I added some yellows, oranges, and reds from the bruising and decay along the edges. Those colors should work well with the red browns that will come in later on the Mantidfly. I carried some of those warm tones to other parts of the leaf. Afterwards, I cleaned up a lot of the edges on the leaf and added more shadows beneath the Mantidfly. I hid all the areas that I just worked on with the hairdryer and then peeled off the frisket. A tracing paper transfer and folding bone were used to get my main lines for the foreground moved over to the paper. Things look super green right now, especially with the white of the paper showing, but once all those warm tones of the Mantidfly go in, it should all balance out. Now it's time to put in all of my lightest local colors to the star of the show. I started with a quick wash of some light green to the transparent part of the wings. I followed that up with some lemon yellow, a pass of browns, some oranges, followed by some dark browns. These Mantidflies are wasp mimics, so they have that familiar super bold pattern with many isolated sections of saturated color. It's fun to paint, but absolutely filled with fine detail. It can be hard to make a plan for a subject like this and keep it looking cohesive. Generally, I worked on one color group at a time. I'll work on my yellows for a while, then switch over to oranges, and then to browns, and so on. That saved time mixing pigments. I usually start with the biggest sections and then work my way to smaller and smaller areas as I go across the page. With wasps, bees, and guys like this where you want crisp edges and really clean color, I find it easiest to paint the light detail first, block in some mid-tone darks, and then only commit to the darkest areas later in the painting. If you put in your super darks too early, they have a tendency to lift and make your saturated lighter colors muddy. 90% of the painting on the Mantidfly was done with a number 2 round brush. I'm using Mimic synthetic brushes here. Those usually stay sharp enough for a lot of detail work for 6 or 7 paintings before they start going dull. Painting the insects is definitely a different discipline from my usual bird subjects. With the birds, you also have a lot of detail, but it's mostly low reflective, streaky, hairy feathers and an occasional glossy beak, feet, or shiny eye. With the insects like this guy, there are a ton of glossy and semi-glossy surfaces with all sorts of smaller details to render. And then you add in those transparent wings. Well, those are always a fun challenge to render. Anytime you're working out of your usual element, you're learning something. You can see from the palette that later glazes are starting to go in more opaquely. I'm progressively sneaking up on my darker values as I add layers. Occasionally I'll switch over to a 10-aught brush for the legs or tiny details around the eye. If I can get away with a bigger number 2 round brush, I'll use that because they hold so much more paint than the tiny brushes. I don't see Mantidflies like this very often. They're night-flying predators, using those gigantic eyes to locate their prey and those big, spiky, folding front legs to capture it. In the daytime, they rely on looking like stinging wasps to avoid being someone else's meal. To render the deep browns, I use cadmium reds, moving to permanent alizarin crimson and then to dioxazine purple. And those are glazed over orange and brownish base colors. For the wings, I wanted to have some sections reading as blackish brown and opaque and others as clear. That's why I lighten up the background with the mid-tone and lighter saturated greens earlier in the painting. Now I can push some of those sections lighter or darker and they'll both show up. For the darks, I used a mix of Indian red and ultramarine blue. I also use that for many of the blackish colors on the insect's body. The head had a ton of tiny details, so I switched back to that tiny 10-aught brush. The eye had an almost prismatic variation to it, changing from pinks to bright blues. While I had the detail brushes out, I hit many of the smaller areas of the legs, feet, and shadows underneath and around them, sharpening up the edges. I switched back to my number 2 round brush and added more passes of blue-green shadows to the leaf. Another glaze of darker colors went on the wings, abdomen, and legs. Many details with super darks were put in the thorax using near blacks made of phthalo green and permanent alizarin crimson. The wings got some dark glazes made of that same phthalo green and cadmium red medium. At this point, the tiny antennae needed to be addressed with the 10-aught brush. They had a beautiful transition from orange at the base to black and red and then yellow at the tip. There was almost endless detail on this Mantidfly, so I was working with a magnifier for the entire time that I worked on it. While the small brushes were out, I spent a lot of time slowly picking away at tiny details, adding darker, sharp edges to colors that were already down to crisp up and define the shapes. The more you look, the more you seem to find that needs to be refined. I was getting close to finished up with the painting, so at this point I'll often step back 10 feet or so and reevaluate things from a distance. In doing so, I decided that the left side of the painting was a little detail heavy and that the right needed some balance. I mixed up a dark using phthalo green, alizarin crimson, and a little dioxazine purple to render a few more holes in the leaf on the right side. I almost immediately liked it better. Now I just needed to add in some more oranges, yellows, and reds to the edges of my new holes. I liked the way the oranges were going over the green and bringing the color of the wasp into the leaf, so I glazed in some additional areas, breaking up the greens a bit. Now I just went around sharpening up more details on the Mantidfly's body and wings before tweaking a lot of details on the leaf's surface. Eventually I ran out of things that I thought needed to be fixed, and I signed it and called it finished. So there you go. That's a 7x10 inch painting of a brown Mantidfly. It was fun to be working on that hot press paper again. It definitely is fussy about taking a smooth wash, but it makes up for that by being fantastic for glazing in detail. Thanks so much for watching. The painting takes shape. I hope you all get a chance to get out the watercolors and paint soon.